Hello, and thank you everyone for coming to this session on the European perspective. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and are feeling suitably rested after the morning session. We have a very distinguished panel, albeit slightly deficient of one member at present. I'll introduce the panelists that we currently have, and we'll make a start anyway. So we have Lord Hill, who scarcely needs introduction. He was, of course, the Commissioner in the European Commission for Financial Stability, Financial Services and the Capital Markets Union, which is a catchy title for a couple of years. And also I heard the accolade of most influential Brit on the continent, was the latest accolade I heard given yesterday. So ideally placed to give us the European perspective, having been at the heart of the European institutions. And we have, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Daniel Mitrenga, who is from the Familienunternehmer Association in Germany, which is an association that represents family-owned businesses in Germany, which, as we all know, is an enviably successful and vibrant sector of their economy. So I'm going to start just by asking both of you to just give us a couple of minutes. We've had a very optimistic, constructive debate and discussion this morning. Do you think that, as David Davis said this morning, we have a very strong mutual interest between the UK and the EU to getting a good settlement from the Brexit process? Do you think currently the European member states and institutions share that vision of a mutually attractive, beneficial solution? Or are we still in danger of being in a position where we're perhaps looking to be given some kind of punishment?
Well, I think where I'd start, if you separate out the economics from the politics, to your first question, I think it is clearly very much in our mutual interests to find a way to handle Brexit that minimises damage as much as possible to both economies. And if you look at this from a European point of view and from a domestic political point of view in many countries, one of the biggest challenges that governments face across Europe is getting re-elected. And if you want to be re-elected, if you want to deal with the pressures that they face politically of what they would call populism, the single thing that I think makes that most likely is continuing and sustained economic growth. And growth is coming back to Europe, but the thing you really want it to do is to continue. So I think from a political point of view, it does make sense to try and handle this separation and divorce in a way that minimizes that. I think when you also look at it from the point of view of individual countries, you can look at different parts of Europe and look at their trade patterns with the United Kingdom. There are a number of individual countries that, as well as the broader European perspective of wanting to keep growth going, they've got direct interests in wanting to make sure that their goods can still be sold into the UK in as easy a way as possible. So I think for both those reasons, the economic case for trying to do it sensibly is pretty self-evident. I think in terms of do you do it separately, do you do it together, I thought actually one of the points David Davis made this morning that was quite interesting was he underlined the fact that the Brits want to deal with Europe as a whole, and that he was arguing, makes it easier for the negotiation if you're negotiating with the 27 as one group than people thinking you're trying to divide and rule. So I think that would be the answer that they would give you as to how you should approach it. And then I think your third question, where do I think that individual institutions will be? Where is business? The honest answer is it's an evolving picture. I think that the mood in Europe, so far as Brexit is concerned, generally has shifted quite a lot. When I left Brussels back in July, the first reaction to Brexit was shock. There we are, is that better? Shock and disappointment. And people were worried about the risk to the broader economy, and worried about the risk of contagion of Brexit more broadly across Europe. I think since then, with successive elections in Europe, where some people over here who proclaimed Brexit as being the first brick in the wall of, or the first brick out of the wall, rather, that was going to precipitate the collapse of the EU in a rather gleeful way, they've been proved wrong so far in terms of the elections in Austria, the Netherlands. We'll see where we end up in France. And so I think that, plus economic growth, is making people in Europe feel more cheerful. And I think people who are more cheerful are in a better place to have a sensible negotiation about the balance of advantage and compromise than people who are sad, depressed and nervous. So I think it is possible to paint a picture whereby if we have a government in the United Kingdom which has a stronger majority, and if this feeling of greater security in Europe continues, that it should be possible to have a more grown-up negotiation that can avoid the risk of us both cutting off our nose to spite our face. But you can't say with certainty at the moment that that's how it'll go.
Thank you. So Daniel, what's the mood like in Germany at the moment? Are we going to be friends?
Lloyd, yes, I hope so, and I try to be as much positive as I can be. When just telling you a little bit more about my what I'm witnessing in Berlin and also in Brussels. I completely agree with your forecast, Lord Hill, and it would probably scratch the way which I would like to see the negotiations go down. But and I don't want to spoil the party, but because I learned, and it was good to have these conversations in the morning, that I learned, could learn that Britain has so much more opportunities despite the negotiations with the EU. But when it comes to Germany, for example, Paul Marshall in the morning said there's the political community and the business community, and the business community here in the UK is much more how can we get on with it, and it's a mixed picture in Germany. It's not that clear in Germany. On the one hand, you have officials which still are, I think, stuck in this moment of angriness and
negativity.
Some negativity, and this idea of cherry picking is still on their mind. And these officials, this is a psychological thing too. They were the ones who built that beautiful, complex European Union over the last 30 years, and now you tell the same people how let's deconstruct it, and it's for the better of you to do it in a positive way. So there we have the officials, and on the other side we have the business community, which to some extent is also following this diplomatic approach, which is bigger than the economic reasoning. So whatever the matter, the EU has to come first, and then we look at the negotiations with the UK. This wouldn't worry me so much if that would come from a position where the EU is very strong. So then that would be kind of bargaining and to create some hedge in the negotiations. But I think this comes from a position where the EU is in very bad shape. Just look at the Eurozone. I know it's not your problem, but the Eurozone is more or less reshaped now to a transfer union, and Germany can't be happy with that. Yeah. But is not standing up against it. And on the other, and there's another point, the EU couldn't finish the TTIP with the United States, and unfortunately Germany didn't play a very constructive role in that process. So, and I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Can I actually follow up on that, Daniel? From the perspective of your members and the real business community who are at the real coalface, the sharp end of trading, who are going to be most immediately and potentially damagingly affected if we don't get a good, amicable, constructive post-Brexit trading relationship. What are their real priorities here, and what are their concerns that that we should be looking to address, and how are they able to communicate that to your government?
Maybe there is a small divide in the business community. The bigger companies and multilaterals, they can construct the rulings of their own somehow with the EU and probably with the UK, say Siemens or the others. They won't have that problems. But when it comes to mid-sized and medium-sized companies, which most of our members are, they are suppliers and they are second step followers, so to say. If BMW changes their investment plans, they will all follow, but they don't probably have an investment strategy on their own. But still, their concerns are that production sites and investments will diminish here in Great Britain.
So, Mats, thank you for joining us. I'll give you a moment to catch your breath.
Now's the time.
So I'll introduce Mats Persson, who is currently Head of International Trade at Ernst & Young. He has a fascinating career in the context of European policymaking, having been director of Open Europe, the very influential think tank, which is another board member of the Prosperity UK conference, and then is probably best known for having been a special advisor to David Cameron during the course of the proposed reform and renegotiation of the EU that David Cameron undertook in 2015-2016. So, Matt, you've obviously been part of European negotiations and policy making from different perspectives, and now you're in the business community. So we were just discussing the different priorities and perspectives for businesses in member states. What are you hearing from your clients at the moment?
From across Europe? Well, I think in terms of European businesses and Brexit, I would say that the vast majority as businesses here want to avoid disruption. They want to limit uncertainty. So that is that I would say is the most common response that we get. There is a minority of businesses who see an opportunity in Brexit in the sense that perhaps grabbing some market shares from UK right. firms and in a certain neighbour to Great Britain in particular, where there are some businesses who see some investment some opportunity around luring investment to that particular country as opposed to them staying in Britain. But broadly speaking, like the vast majority of UK firms, European businesses that I speak to want a smooth and orderly Brexit. They see very little upside in this dragging on and in this being a matter of disruption and uncertainty.
And so I'll just follow that up again, as we did with Daniel. Are those voices being heard in their governments, and is that message being passed up to the European institutions?
So I think there is it's difficult to tell, to be honest. It's not entirely easy to get a feel for how effective that effort is, partly because I think a lot of European businesses, and this is my personal experience, others may have completely different experience, but I think for a lot of European businesses, Brexit hasn't been as real as for UK businesses, so therefore they perhaps have been a bit slower in reacting in terms of lobbying efforts. But I mean, there's no doubt that if you're a German car manufacturer, of course you're going to be an important voice. Everyone rightly mentions that as an example, and you can take a number of similar examples across sectors. Take Deutsche Bank, which is a branch in the UK, and if you have to subsidiarize Deutsche Bank, that doesn't happen overnight. So you know what I mean. So there are loads of examples of where European businesses have big stakes here and would want to get the voice heard, but it's very difficult to tell at this point in time, at least from where I sit, the extent to which they're influential with European governments. And I mean, as many others have pointed out over the last several months, this will be very much a political negotiation as well as an economic negotiation. So it is that dialectic between the politics and economics that will matter.
So on that, I'll come to you, Lord Hill. How, from your experience of working within the European institutions, within the Commission, how can the UK government, UK officials, and the UK business community, how can they be reaching out, building alliances, making the case here, and having, the voice heard, almost in support of the European business community who may struggle to advocate their positions? What can British people do on the British side to really make those alliances and make the case?
Yeah, I think to start with, you have to take a step back and think about how the European system works, which is it's a rules-based legalistic system with a sort of political topspin. And so some of the issues early on that were causing, I think, greatest potential misunderstanding were issues around some of the things said during the referendum campaign over here, in terms of saying that we could leave the EU, end free movement of people, and still be part of the single market. And those kinds of statements, which are not possible to deliver in terms of the way that the European system works, because as a basic principle, the four freedoms are indivisible. Those kinds of statements didn't help in terms of having a kind of clarity and consistency of position that you need to have if you're going to have a grown-up negotiation. So I think the fact that since then the British government has made clear that it's not, from that point of view, seeking to use the phrase to have its cake and eat it, that it realises that ending free movement of people means we won't be in the single market, that some of those obstacles to understanding have been removed. In terms of what else, how should we approach it going forward, I think, I say clarity, consistency will help. I think a greater awareness on the parts of the Brits about how some of the stuff we say and the language we use goes down elsewhere in the European Union. I mean, one of the drawbacks from which we suffer is that Europeans, are often really quite intelligent and well-educated and can read our media. and they do read our media, they follow our politics. I know almost no one in British politics who picks up and reads the French media, the German media, or any other media. And there are some obvious linguistic reasons for that, but it's also to do with a general interest in the outside world and some of our neighbours. So I think the way in which we often talk about things in the UK aimed at a domestic audience in our politics, we don't realise sometimes the impact that that has when it's read in places like Germany. So when we make assertions about what we believe the German car industry will do, it doesn't go down terribly well in Germany, and it doesn't actually reflect always the reality of how German business and politics work together. So I do think, to use the phrase that John Major used the other day, my former boss, that a bit more graciousness on our part sometimes, a bit more care about our language, a fewer assertions of they need us more than we need them, and more emphasizing the things we have in common rather than the things that drive us apart. And I think it's very easy to make a case about a common European interest to do with financial stability, to do with sustained growth, to do with investment, to do with the ability of capital to flow easily to European corporates, most of which comes through London. But we need to do that in a way that's driven by the desire to have a partnership rather than some of the ways we talked about it during the referendum debate.
Daniel, what are your thoughts on that? Is there any possibility for UK businesses to operate a charm offensive with the national and local governments in Germany and try and make that case?
It's not on me to advise the British people on that side, but I think that would be a good idea. Do a campaign and don't lose your sympathy, which you for sure still have as a country and as a free trade nation. When I speak of the business society and or community, and that would help, because sector by sector they are now going to their governments and say, be aware of this and of that. But as a whole, there's no strong position at the moment, except our association, which is asking for a pragmatic deal, whatever the sector is, so.
But presumably, is there a sense that the German car makers, which is always the example that gets used here, surely they must, even the big German car makers who have a very strong interest in the single market, they must prefer to have zero tariffs on their exports to the UK. They'd rather have no tariffs than have tariffs.
Technically,
or
I think,
even,
yeah,
not even that.
You're right, and technically, I think we will come to that point,
right,
sooner or later. But my impression is that from this conference today is that you want to be very quick, and when Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Tusk and the others say we do it step by step, we want to see some progress in divorcing before we talk about the other stuff. This is not such a positive link, I think, because or such a positive signal, because on that you will lose time, and we had that before, that argument that once the UK is sticking to the European rules, they won't be there is not so much bargaining with the rest of the world,
Mats, Daniel's just alluded there to the sequencing of the negotiations and the financial settlement being progressed. What are your thoughts on how that's going to work out? And is there a difference in positions between different member states as between those who really prioritize the ongoing trading relationships versus those who are more worried potentially about the financial settlement? And how are those, is there a risk that there might be some fragmentation of positions on those lines?
Yeah, well, I think it could be a lot worse, to be honest, on the sequencing. I think many had feared that the EU side would insist on completely settling the bill first and then move on to the FTA negotiations. I think now the draft guidelines talk about, significant progress or a formulation similar to that, which I think is a lot better than the alternative. So, so in that sense, there's hope. I think there will be a lot of different positions amongst member states. Our experience from the renegotiation is that positions change. There's there's quite a bit of a fluid environment. A member state can all of a sudden become a quite, you know, I hesitate to use the word obstacle, but a bit more of a challenge over any given issue. Gibraltar featured in news quite recently, for example. It can be another country, another issue tomorrow. So, and you will have a lot of that, and member states' positions will diverge a bit over that. But I think as of the current state of play is reasonably encouraging on the sequencing.
So, what we haven't actually touched on so far, which is clearly another big issue that's been in the news certainly this week, is the election cycle in a couple of key member states, namely France and Germany. I'll turn to you first, Lord Hill. What impact do you think the elections in France and in Germany could have on this? And I'm thinking, in particular, not so much the risk of Marine Le Pen being elected here, but the fallout from the fact that 49% of the French electorate voted for Eurosceptic parties. How's that going to affect our position with the French negotiators?
Yeah, I think, it's the point in a way, a variant of the point that Mats was making, is that this is a fluid situation. It's very hard at any given point to be definitive about what any one thing means. I think the fact that it looks likely, but not certain, that Macron will win in France, I think it was my earlier point, for those who were worried 6 months ago that Brexit was the first of many and that there was going to be a kind of existential crisis across Europe, I think that fear reduces. I think that clearly how Macron delivers an effective government and a reform programme, and how he translates his pro-European feelings into a concrete programme of reform across Europe are big questions. But I think if you look at it the other way around, if Netherlands, Austria and France had gone the other way, then I think the effect of that on Brexit would have been to make the whole thing far more brittle and uncertain. And I think in those circumstances, the political will that you need in order to make compromises in Europe would have been lower. And if it's lower, you end up doing more extreme stuff driven by the flip-flop of politics. So I think one of the things that we all need to strive for, and it's one of the ideas behind this conference, is that the more rational we are, the calmer we are, the quicker we move, the more constructive we are, the more in Britain we spend time trying to articulate the future partnership we want with Europe in a constructive way, the greater the chance we have of reducing the risk of the two extremes of the political debate in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, whipping each other up into a frenzy of excitement and trying to crash the thing into a brick wall for completely different and opposed political objectives. And so I think the election results in France and so far and in the other countries reduce the grip that the more excitable factions in Europe and the UK are likely to have, and I think that increases the chance of a sensible negotiation.
So Daniel, we also have elections coming up in Germany this year. Is there any danger that Frau Merkel won't be re-elected? And if she's not, can we expect any major changes in policy from a potential new form of government in Germany?
No guess on the outcome at this stage, but whatever the outcome might be, let's say it's a grand coalition or something in the middle, I think two processes will start after the German election. Like Lord Hill said, with the UK, regarding the UK, we will see some moving forward there, some substantial gains there, and on the other process would be, I think, to discuss the way the EU is going to reform itself, and because this process won't be taken any further, I think, in 2017. But luckily, or shamingly, it needed the UK to leave the EU before scratching a white paper, whatever will come out of this, but before scratching a white paper in Brussels with different scenarios. So, but this is another point. I think we only create a win-win situation when the EU gets more flexibility in itself. You know, so then you have a more attractive and more globalized EU in your front, in your front yard. And on the other hand, we need I think a strong free trader, which is showing to the EU it doesn't need to take 7 years to create a FTA or something, would also help a lot.
Yeah, I should add that Daniel's organisation produced a very interesting paper calling for reforms in the EU around about the time of the referendum, which makes them, I suspect, somewhat of an outlier in amongst German business. But it was I recommend looking it up. It is with typical German efficiency and quality available in English as well as German. Mats, what do you think is the process going to look like from here on? Is it going to be a rough ride? Is it going to be going right up to the wire in the best tradition of European summits with late nights and starving ministers being starved into submission? Or do we think the way the progress of the Commission guidelines so far, is that indicating that it's going to be a reasonably smooth process, dare we hope?
There's nothing smooth about this process. There's nothing smooth about Brexit. Whether it was the right or wrong decision, it's a big and extremely complicated exercise. So to your question, I think it's definitely the former. This will come down to the wire. 2 years to negotiate across the board in all these range of areas, ranging from regulation to immigration to justice and home affairs to foreign affairs, etc. It's an extremely tight timetable, and it's probably in practice it will be even shorter than that. So no, I think this will come down to the wire. What I hope will happen, because there is such a tight timetable, what I hope will happen is that there will be some early principle commitments, and circling back to the business interest. If there's one thing I hear from businesses in the UK, across Europe, it's the wanting to avoid a cliff edge type situation. So an early principle commitment to a transition arrangement, whatever agreement has been made.
And do you think that's feasible, given the EU's usual commitment to nothing is agreed till everything is agreed?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's being optimistic, but again, if
it certainly seems sensible.
Yeah, but if you look at the guidelines, the mandate sort of on both sides, they kind of move. They're already moving in that direction a bit.
Yes.
Again, it could have been a lot worse. So I don't know if it's something reasonable to expect, but that's my hope. And equally, if you can get some early principle commitment, the quicker you can get stuff like people already here, agreed, the better. That would be a very strong signal. Of course, if you can settle the bill early, great signal that negotiations are happening in a reasonably smooth manner. If you start to stall on those points, on people and money, early on, then I think we're in for some rocky
Lord
waters.
Hill, what's your view on that? Are we going to have ministers starved in submission in meeting rooms in Brussels at the closing days of March 2019?
No, I largely agree with Mats. I mean, this is complicated and detailed and difficult and fraught, and you know, some of the big stuff I think will only be decided late on. I think the only point where I differ from Mats, I mean, I agree about people, about migration. Trying to sort that out first. I mean, listening to David Davis this morning, I mean, he singled that and the Irish question out as being the first two priorities, where he I mean, seemed to be signalling some optimism that he and Barnier can sit down first and try and talk about that. I think the money is harder to resolve early on, because I think there's clearly going to have to be some acceptance that some money is going to have to be paid. But quantum, I think, is very difficult, because how much you're prepared to pay is, you know, will in some way be linked to what are you going to get in exchange at the end of it.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone would like to ask the panel any questions. Rosine. Oh, there's a microphone coming.
Razin Sali, National University of Singapore, and on the Legatum Special Trade Commission. This is a question for Lord Hill and Mats. Britain was singularly bad at coalition building in the EU with the like-minded, but I would guess that coalition building is going to be vital in these 2 years and beyond. So what are your thoughts on the kinds of coalitions we need to build within the EU on particular issues in order to make progress? And is Britain capable of doing it?
Well, I think first off, I think if you look at some of the detailed kind of policy issues that were being dealt with every day in Europe, actually the Brits on some of this detailed stuff, I think, were far better at building coalitions on trying to resolve things in a way that kind of worked than they're given credit for. I mean, I did not buy for one moment the kind of accusation that Britain didn't have any influence within the European system when it came to trying to affect legislation. So I'd lay off a bit from your first kind of starting point that we weren't any good at building coalitions at that level. I do feel more generally that over a period of time, our diplomatic investment, to put it like that, in terms of relationships across Europe, and actually more generally in the world, has reduced. I mean, I think at a time when we talk about wanting to be more outward-looking, global, and all the rest of it, a good starting place is actually to find out what people think in other countries and to talk to them rather than to assert that we know what they think in other parts of the world. So I think we have got to bulk up our diplomatic work urgently, and it would be better if we were facing the situation we're now facing with more capital in the bank than we have. But that said, I think, you know, there is no alternative but to find ways of trying to increase that capital. And I think, you know, our Foreign Office now should have a much bigger role than it has had in more recent years, where because of our membership of the EU, the nature of its bilateral relations with a whole range of European countries has obviously been reduced, and it now needs to reverse that. I think the British government needs to think about how it is going to reinvest in that, both in Europe and more generally across the world. I don't know, Mats, if you want to.
Mats, do you want to quickly add something, and then we'll
Yeah,
close
no,
up?
I mean, I also agree with Lord Hill that Britain had more influence than what people often gave it credit for. But that is all water under the bridge now. And I think you're raising a really important question. And I would say, I mean, if there are broadly three different areas, these are just my categories. It's the sort of trade single market agenda. It's the justice and home affairs, police cooperation area, and then a sort of foreign policy. I'm sure loads of others, but those are the three areas where I think you sort of, if you can start build coalitions in those three areas a bit, that's a very good start. And I think on the second and the third one, it's probably easier for Britain than in the first one, for reasons that we had discussed. Echoing everything that has been said, it's a lot about tone, it's a lot about understanding what others want, their economic and political incentives, equipping them to tell a story at home that will work for them at home, as well as giving Britain a decent deal. It's the usual stuff that Britain actually is quite good at once it digs in and go for it.
That's great. Well, we're out of time, so I'll just end by saying thank you to our panel.